Number 5. This has got to be one of the saddest moments of a person's departure ever recorded. The event is the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix at the Zandvoort circuit in the Netherlands, and the driver was Roger Williamson. It was only Williamson's second Formula 1 appearance after his debut at the British Grand Prix. As he was on the 8th lap, it's thought that a tyre failure caused his car to flip upside down and catch fire. Although he was not seriously injured by the accident itself, he was trapped under the car as it was engulfed in flames. Another driver and personal friend, David Purley, saw the crash and pulled over to help. As can be seen in the video, he tries in vain to try and right the car, but as there's no one there to help, he runs across the track to get a fire extinguisher from a marshal. Several marshals gather at the scene but just look on as Purley desperately tries to put out the flames. When the extinguisher is emptied, he tries to get them to right the car, but because they have no protective clothing and poor emergency training, no one helps. The clearly desperate and dejected Purley is forced to leave his friend to die in the burning wreck. It took 8 minutes for the first fire engine to arrive and finally put out the flames, but by then it was far too late to save Williamson, who had died of asphyxiation and the effects of the fire. Purley later stated that he could hear Williamson screaming from under the car. He was awarded the George Medal for the bravery he displayed in his attempts to save Williamson. After the accident, fireproof clothing was made mandatory for all trackside marshals, so that they will be able to assist in the event of a fire, and there was also a noticeable increase in the number of drivers stopping at accidents to help in the rescue efforts. Number 4. On April 15, 1989, a football match between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest at the Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, England would turn into the worst stadium disaster in English sports history and one of the worst football disasters in the world. BBC cameras were at the match televising it, and the unfolding disaster was broadcast live to millions across the United Kingdom. On that day, 96 people were crushed to death and 766 were injured. The match was the FA Cup semi-final, and because of a reputation for football violence at the time between fans of different clubs, a neutral venue was chosen. The opposing fans were sectioned off from each other by fencing them into pens, and this contributed to the problems that would ensue. The crush occurred in the section allocated to the Liverpool fans, the entry to which was via one of only 7 old turnstiles. This led to dangerous overcrowding outside the stadium for those trying to get in before the match started. As a result, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, the senior police officer at the match, ordered an exit gate to be opened. This led via a tunnel to 2 already overcrowded pens. As more people piled into the fenced-off areas, fans started to climb over the fences to escape the crush. Within moments of the match starting, a crush barrier failed and fans started to fall on top of each other. The match was stopped after 6 minutes, and desperate fans tried to help each other over the fencing, with the injured being carried away on improvised stretchers made from torn-down advertising hoardings. Although 44 ambulances arrived, only 1 was let into the stadium by the police. The rest were left caught up in the crowds outside. After the event, senior police officer David Duckenfield falsely claimed that the exit gate had been forced open by the Liverpool fans. The police claimed that many Liverpool fans had no tickets, were drunk, and attacked the police both outside and inside the ground. In 1989, the Taylor inquiry came to the conclusion that the police action greatly contributed to the disaster due to poor judgment and leadership. Although the actions of individual officers in the grounds under appalling circumstances were praised, it was highly critical of Duckenfield, saying that he had failed in his leadership. After continued pressure for a public inquiry into the disaster, and over 23 years later, in September 2012, an independent panel concluded that the authorities had tried to push the blame onto the fans, had withheld important documents for the original 1989 inquiry, and there had been alteration by the police of 116 witness statements. Out of the 96 people that died, it's now believed that up to 41 of them could have been saved if they had received prompt medical treatment and more ambulances had been let into the grounds. The report also showed multiple failures by the emergency services which contributed to the death toll. On the 19th of December 2012, a new inquest was granted in the High Court, which is now ongoing. Number 3. The Challenger space shuttle disaster of January 28, 1986 not only ended the lives of the 7 crew, but also dealt a huge blow to NASA and American national pride. The shuttle took off from Cape Canaveral, Florida on an unusually cold January morning after days of delays and technical issues. The makers of the solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, Morton Thiokol, were concerned that the O-rings that sealed the joints would not work correctly in the cold conditions on the morning of the launch. They held discussions with NASA managers and urged the mission to be postponed, but NASA staff, already frustrated by the large number of previous delays, opposed it, even though the O-rings in question were a criticality 1 component, meaning that if they failed, there were no backups, and their failure would mean the destruction of the entire craft and the loss of all on board. The O-rings had only been designed to work down to 12 degrees C, not normally a problem for the launch area in Florida, but on this January morning, temperatures were down to a very unusual and low -1 degrees C, and as such, the O-rings lost their ability to seal in the hot gases from the rocket fuel as it burned. At takeoff, a puff of grey smoke was recorded by the launch cameras from the right SRB. This was the hot gas leaking past the damaged O-ring. This temporarily sealed itself as the rocket fuel burned. Later in the flight, this would open up again to allow a hot jet of gas, like a giant welder's blowtorch, to burn through the supporting strut and puncture the external fuel tank. Within a fraction of a second of a breakup, the main fuel tank exploded 73 seconds into the flight at an altitude of 48,000 feet. The crew module of the shuttle survived the breakup of the launch vehicle, and it's now believed that most of the crew were alive as it fell back to Earth. 4 of the recovered personal egress air packs worn by the crew were found to have been activated, and switches on the control panels, which had lockout protection, had been moved from their launch positions. However, whilst the crew may have survived the breakup and the fall, they couldn't survive the impact with the sea at approximately 200 miles an hour. The incident was seen live by approximately 40 million people around the world, and the subsequent investigation found many flaws in the safety and working practices at NASA and grounded the shuttle program for 3 years, but ultimately it proved that the shuttle program was nowhere near as safe as NASA had led everyone to believe. Number 2. On the 22nd of August 2015, a Hawker Hunter T7 vintage jet was performing at the Shoreham Air Display at Shoreham Airport when, as it was completing a loop manoeuvre, it failed to pull up in time and crashed onto a busy main road running next to the airport. It was the worst British airshow disaster since an accident at the 1952 Farnborough Airshow that killed 29 spectators. The aircraft involved was a 1955 Hawker Hunter T7, which had been used by the RAF from 1955 until early 1990s, when they were all retired. The aircraft, which was privately owned since 1998, was a common feature of air shows around the United Kingdom. The pilot on that day was 51-year-old Andy Hill, a highly experienced ex-RAF pilot with over 12,000 flight hours, and also worked as a British Airways captain. He had also flown the Harrier jump jet and was also an instructor for the RAF before joining British Airways. For the display, the aircraft started with a low pass along the runway. It then turned and flew the other way before pulling up into an inside loop. This manoeuvre started at a height of 200 feet, which left little room for error. Before it completed the loop, the aircraft came down in a nose-high attitude on the westbound carriageway of a busy A27, hitting and destroying several cars. Plane broke into 4 parts, and the fuel from the tanks immediately ignited, setting fire to many of the cars that had been hit. The pilot was thrown clear in his ejector seat and survived with serious injuries, but 11 people in the cars and on the ground at the location of the crash were killed and 16 more were injured. At the time of this video being made, the investigation into the disaster is still ongoing. Number 1. The 24-hour Le Mans crash of 1955 in France has gone down as the deadliest crash in motor racing history that was also caught on film. In 1955, the Le Mans track was pretty much the same as it was when it was first opened in 1923, but back then cars were only capable of about 60 miles an hour. By 1955, the race cars of the day were achieving up to 190 miles an hour, and this had a major contribution to the death toll of this crash. On lap 35, Pierre Levesque in a Mercedes 300 SLR was following the leading Jaguar D-Type of Mike Hawthorn. Approaching the pit lane, Hawthorn passed the slower Austin Healey of Lance Macklin and saw the Jaguar crew signalling him for a pit stop. He cut in front of Macklin and slowed suddenly to enter the pits. This caused Macklin to swerve across the track into the path of Levesque, who was travelling at approximately 150 miles an hour behind him. Levesque's Mercedes hit Macklin's car from behind and became airborne. It flew over a protective embankment and into the spectator area before hitting a concrete stairwell head-on. This caused the Mercedes to break up and throw the engine, bonnet and front axle into the crowd. The bonnet decapitated tightly jammed spectators like a guillotine, whilst the engine hit those who climbed ladders and scaffolding to get a better view of the race. The rest of the car landed on the embankment and caught fire. However, the Mercedes was constructed of lightweight magnesium, which when heated in the petrol fire burst into white-hot flames, showering the crowd in magnesium embers. When the rescue workers arrived, they were totally unfamiliar with a magnesium fire and poured water onto the wreck, which reacted with the burning magnesium, making the fire much worse, and the car continued to burn for several hours. Levesque was thrown from the car but was killed on impact with the ground. In all, 84 people were killed, including Levesque, and 120 injured. The race was continued in an attempt to stop departing spectators from blocking the arriving ambulances. 8 hours after the accident, and as a mark of respect, the remaining Mercedes cars were pulled from the race. They invited Jaguar to also retire, but they declined and went on to win the race. Hawthorne was initially blamed as the cause of the crash, but later an official inquiry ruled that he was not to blame and it had just been a tragic accident. The deaths of the spectators were blamed on inadequate safety standards, and the grandstand and pit areas were demolished and rebuilt. In the aftermath, Mercedes withdrew from motor racing and didn't return for a further 30 years. In order to avoid similar accidents from happening again, motor racing was banned in France, Spain, Switzerland, Germany and other nations until the tracks could be brought to a higher safety standard. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then don't forget to please thumbs up and subscribe for more, and if you have any ideas for videos you'd like to see, then please let us know in the comments below.